Mastering is the final stage before you release your song to the world. After you've written the song, arranged it, recorded it, produced it, and then mixed it, mastering is that final filter that you're going through before it gets released. In this video, I'm going to show you how to master a track in Reaper using only stock plugins. Although if you want to use third-party plugins that you've grown to love, you can follow this process along as well. Just use the same sort of settings. It will all translate. First, we need to insert a stereo WAV file for our final mix into a new Reaper project. And you can do this by simply dragging it from the folder that it's in into Reaper on the grid, and it'll automatically create a new track for you. Make sure that you're using a WAV file rather than an MP3, as WAV files are much higher quality. The main reason for having a separate project in Reaper for mastering, rather than just mastering in the project that you mix the song in, is so that you can commit to your final mix and move on to the mastering process. This isn't a process for fixing all of the minute details. This is a process in which we look at the song as a whole and see how we can better it, and also how we can raise the volume. If you find yourself mixing at the same time as you're mastering, then you haven't moved on, so you need to really commit to the final mix and then move on to mastering. Another reason is to free up your computer's processing power. Some mastering plugins can be quite CPU intensive, and in a mix you're going to have already quite a lot of CPU intensive plugins, and just the general amount of plugins is going to be intense. So it's best to have a new project so that you can start fresh and not worry too much about if your computer can handle it. If you're mastering multiple tracks for a project like an EP or an album, then you can put all of the stereo WAV final mix files into this project. You may want to tweak some minor things for each song in the project, but typically the mastering chain will stay pretty much the same throughout the entire album. So the first effect that I like to use in mastering is saturation. It adds a little bit of warmth, a little bit of character to your track, and also saturation naturally does compress things a bit, and I find that I get a much better result using saturation to compress a bit first than just going too heavy on the compression. Now ignore the extra tracks that I've got here. It's purely so that you can see the track in the mixer below, as my head's blocking it. So that's the only reason why I've got them there. You'll only need one track. So the Reaper effect for saturation is called saturation, believe it or not, and I'm just going to add this to my track. So to test the amount of effect that I want on my track, I'm going to choose the loudest part of my track just so that I can hear how much is saturating when it's really going. So let's have a listen to this. So yeah, as you hear, going all the way to 100% is way too much. It starts to get quite cluttered. I can't really hear the vocals as clearly when it's saturated that much. So for this, a little goes a long way. And that's a general rule for most mastering plugins. I find that if you go too hard with any of the plugins, then you're just going to end up with an undesirable sound. And remember, you're not just affecting little elements of the track. You can get away with it when you're doing mixing because you can be a bit more drastic with specific elements, but here whatever you do to one thing, it's done to everything, so it gets messy really quickly. So let's have a listen and let's dial in a saturation that I'm happy with. So for me, I think the right amount is 9%. I know that seems ridiculously low, but I'm aiming for a warmer sound without really changing the balance of everything. And I find that when I push it past 20 or even 15, I start to lose that balance that I worked on in my mix. So that starts to take away from the song rather than adding to it, which is the whole purpose of mastering. So I'll show you it again without the saturation, and then I'll put the saturation on midway through. And as you can hear, it's not the most noticeable effect in the world, but it's definitely there. You can hear it being a bit more present, a bit more full, and in general, that's going to be the steps we're going to take in mastering. And once you add all of these steps up, these small little movements, it's going to result in a track that sounds polished and ready to go onto the streaming platforms. For a third-party recommendation, I would really recommend the Virtual Tape Machine by Slate Digital. It's a saturator, but it also is a tape machine emulator, so it just gives a bit more analog warmth to it, and you have a lot of control over how the bass is affected. I particularly use that in my mixes on kick drums as well, just to add a bit of extra oomph to it. So it's just a great plugin, and I find that out of all of the tape emulations and saturations I've used for mastering, that one just gives me the best results. But once again, you can definitely use the stock plugins. So let's move on to the next effect. So the next effect that we're going to be using is Corrective EQ, and we're just going to use the standard REA EQ plugin with Reaper. And this process is just about addressing those frequency areas which maybe are a bit too much in the mix. We're not going to be doing any extreme frequency cuts here. That's for mixing. That's for when you're fixing any problems. If it's a snaring or something harsh that's coming through, that's when you do it in mixing. But for mastering, we're shaping the tone. So these are going to be minute frequency adjustments just to address any problem areas where there's a bit too much build-up of a certain frequency range, and we can just bring that back a bit. So let's load up REA EQ. So now we're going to listen through, I'm going to listen to the loudest bit again, because usually when everything's going, you're going to hear all of the frequencies that are in the track build up in certain areas. So you can start thinking, okay, maybe there's a bit too much of that frequency range going on here. The build up is just a bit much. So let's shape that a bit. Sometimes it can be a bit harder to hear where your frequency build-ups are. Maybe you don't have any, but typically you're going to have a couple. I know that in my mixes, I do have an EQ on the master bus just to shape the overall sound a bit. So I have already looked at this before, but having fresh ears, having not heard this in about a week or two, I'm going to have a little listen by boosting some frequency ranges up and then just sort of saying, and then just sort of seeing, okay, maybe that could do with coming down a little bit. But don't do too much, because if you boost it too much, then you're going to be like, that's crazy. And then when you boost it down, your ears are so used to the boosted bit that it just sounds like too little and you get in a whole mess. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that. And once again, it's very minute adjustments. I think I've got 0.3 dB reduction, 0.3 dB reduction. Okay, I really like 0.3 apparently. It's so subtle and you may not notice it. I'm cutting here about 12K just because I know that if I'm reducing some of this, it might get a bit too harsh. So I just want to remove a little bit of that top end to compensate for this. And here, yeah, I'm cutting at 242. It just had a bit too much clutter going on in that area. And for 800 Hertz, I was just found it was giving a little bit too much of a boxy effect. I did also, when I was listening, hear some areas which I would like to boost, but that's for the next section. And if you want a recommendation for a third-party plugin, I cannot recommend FabFilter Q3 any higher. It's not only an EQ, but it's a dynamic EQ, meaning you can compress specific areas of the frequency range, and it sort of acts as a multi-band compressor. You don't get as many options with it, but it's just a really good EQ, especially for mastering, but for anything really. And I love that plugin. So next we have Creative EQ, which is where you boost frequencies that maybe are lacking in the mix, or some frequency ranges that you think just bring out a certain element of the mix that you feel really serves the song. And once again, we're going to be really subtle with it. So let's get up REA EQ. So I'm going to have a listen again, and I'm going to play around with the different frequency ranges. And typically I don't adjust the bandwidth because I do want it to be relatively wide so that it's getting a range of frequencies rather than focusing on a specific one. If it's starting to affect frequencies that I don't want it to, then I will make it tighter, or if it's not wide enough, I will make it wider. But with the Corrective EQ, I found that the bandwidth of 2 is absolutely fine. So let's have a listen, let's play around with some frequencies and see how we can better this track. awesome. So I'm happy with that. You can probably hear why I was making the decisions I did, but I'll go through it anyway. So here we have a 7 dB boost at 50 Hertz, and I've lowered the bandwidth to 1.2. I really wanted to focus in on the bass drum. Obviously, I'm not going to go super low with the bandwidth because once again, we're doing subtle things to the overall track. But I just want to find where that kick drum was really getting a lot of body from, and obviously this is naturally going to boost up the bass a little bit. I didn't want to boost that up too much, hence why I focused it even more, but it's going to do it because that's where the bass lives. But the main reason was to bring out the kick body a little bit more. And then over here I have a 0.9 dB boost, about 3.5k. This is just to make the vocals a little more present. I do think that the lowering of the higher frequencies in the corrective EQ did compensate for the fact that I'm boosting this up, and I don't think that it's lost any of that high-end sort of crispness, but it's not overpowering because of that. So let's have a listen with both of the EQs off, and I'll add them both in and sort of take one off, put one in, you know, have a play with the EQ being on and off, just so that you can hear what it's actually doing. So yeah, what I hear, and hopefully you can hear it too, make sure you're listening to this on decent headphones because you're not going to hear this through a phone speaker. But what I can hear is, without the subtractive EQ or the corrective EQ, more noticeably a build up in the sort of 200 Hertz range, and also that 500 Hertz range to 800. And then with the creative EQ on, I can hear the vocals a little bit more clearly. Not so much that it's overpowering, but it's just sitting on top a bit more, which is nice. And then that kick drum body is just thumping through a bit more, which is really where you need to have some good headphones on to hear that, because yeah, whatever sort of small speaker you might be listening on is just not really going to cut it. And yeah, of course, both of these adjustments are very small, but I'm just looking to add that little bit of flavor into the track. I'm not trying to fix anything. I was happy with the balance when I mixed it, so this is just to further polish it and just see what we can do to make this track fully finished. Third-party plugin recommendations. My personal favorite for creative EQ is the Poigtec EQ P1A. This is an emulation by Waves of a piece of actual analog hardware, and it's just one of the most musical EQs that I've ever heard. It raises the top end and bottom end in a really pleasing way without it sounding too harsh or too clinical. It's just really well balanced in the way that it boosts and cuts frequencies, and it definitely has a certain character to it, which does give you the feeling that you're playing more of an instrument than a tool. So now that we've done EQ, let's go on to compression. So now we're moving on to compression, and this is where we can give that final sort of glue that's going to make our track just sit right with all of the different elements, and it's just that final little touch where it's gonna squash the dynamics a bit, but not too much. Once again, we're gonna go very subtle with this, and something important to listen out for is not the volume change, but the actual effect the compression is having on the audio. We're going to do volume stuff in a bit, but first we actually want to see how the compression is affecting the sound, because our ears are naturally going to hear something that's louder as better, so don't fall for that trap. We all have, don't worry, but like, yeah, it's very easy to be like, oh, this sounds so much better, but that's only because it's louder. Has the effect actually done anything? Is it doing too much? So let's get going with some compression. So we're just going to click add, and just like with EQ, we're going to use REA comp, and this is a stock plugin, of course. And here it is. It may look a bit daunting at first, but I'm going to quickly just go through what you need to know. So the things to focus on are attack, release, ratio, knee size, maybe, but it's not as essential as those three. And then over here you have your wet and your dry. So wet is the amount of effect that's coming through, and dry is how much of that dry signal do you want. I'm not typically going to worry about the dry level in mastering, just because if I'm going to do any sort of parallel compression, which is where you have quite an aggressive compression setting, mixed in with the dry signal to get the desired effect that you want. I would normally do that in the mixing stage because then I can parallel compress different elements in different amounts. I mean, sometimes it might work great for mastering, and I would definitely encourage you to play around with it if you're not getting quite the desired effect you want from compression. But typically, I don't do this unless something feels like it's missing. And then over here is probably one of the most important controls, which is threshold. And threshold is basically you just telling the compressor at what volume do you want the compressor to kick in. So, for example, if you go down here at minus 10.9 dB, when any audio reaches that point, that audio is going to get compressed. And then to explain the attack is how quickly do you want the compression to kick in. Here it's 3 milliseconds by default. If you want it straight away, you can have that, or if you want it to kick in quite a bit later. And then release is how long after the threshold has been crossed do you want the compression to stay on, basically. And ratio is just how much do you want the compressor to reduce the volume of your mix. Do you want it to be 2-to-1, which means it will half it, 4-to-1, which means it will divide it by 4, and so on. You can figure that bit out. So yeah, these are the settings that you're really going to be playing about with in this compressor for mastering. But if you want to know more, you can always look up each of these different things and what they do. But typically, I don't really mess with these too much when I'm mastering. It's all about the attack, release, ratio, and the threshold. And in terms of the wet, just making sure it's at 0, because that means that it's 100% wet signal. And definitely don't be afraid to play about with some presets. Presets are a great way to figure out how a plugin works, and there's no shame in it at all. I definitely learned a lot from doing that. So I'm going to go back to default just to play about with it and have a little listen. Once again, doing this at the loudest part of the song where the most is going on, because that's where the compressor is going to be working the hardest anyway. So let's give it a listen. So this bar here, as you may see, it didn't start doing anything until I turned up the ratio, because if it's a ratio of 1-to-1, then it's not going to compress anything because it's dividing itself by 1, which is itself. So this bar here is gain reduction, and all it's doing is telling you how much the signal is being compressed, how much gain is being reduced. I typically aim for 1 to 2 dB of gain reduction. If I feel like I need more, rather than going for 4 on one, I'd probably go for 2 on 2 different compressors, or even the same compressor, just because I find that it's a more natural sound than squishing the track with just one. And with that, you can get a track that sounds like it's coming from the era of the loudness war, where everything was about getting your track to be as loud as possible and didn't really sound too great. There's some great albums from them. Yeah, it just sort of ruined the dynamic range of a song, and I'm not looking for that. I'm looking for a song with dynamic range and with movement. I don't want just a static sort of volume the whole way through. And if you want an example of this, just check out Death Magnetic by Metallica. It came out in 2008, I think, and yeah, very typical example of an overcompressed record. Sorry guys. So yeah, let's play about with the attack and release now, just to see how quickly do I want this to come in. And I'm doing this with my ears 100%. I'll also play about with the ratio, and something to definitely mention is the attack and release. If you're too quick with the release specifically, but also the attack, you can start to get a lot of distortion in the master, which is not what I want. We've dealt with that in saturation. I wanted a little bit of warmth there. I don't want to cause some digital distortion here. That's not what I'm looking for. And if you heard, when I'm messing around with that release, if I go too high, it starts to sound really sort of like slow pumping. If I go too low, then it's not doing as much compression as I want it to. The sort of sweet spot is finding that bit in between, which compresses your track enough, doesn't cause that super slow pump. Because if you think about it, if it's got a long release, it's going to duck and then take ages to get back up. So you do hear that. I don't really want to hear that, but I don't want it to be so quick that it starts to distort the track. So just to show you what a high ratio does, if you could hear it, anything that was getting compressed above there was just getting shoved back down, and you get this really horrible, consistent sort of dynamic range. And I know that we're aiming for a bit more of a consistent dynamic range, but I still want some. I don't want to completely smash the compressor onto the track. So now what I'm going to do is listen through and just try and get the volume of the compressed sound to be the same as the volume as the uncompressed sound. And if you noticed, I increased the attack a bit more. I just felt like it was really suffocating the sound of the song when it was a bit too low. I wanted to have the 1 to 2 dB gain reduction, hence why I lowered the threshold. But by increasing the attack, it's just coming on a little slower. It doesn't feel as much like it's clamping down straight onto it. It's more gently evening out those dynamics rather than being something very aggressive. So yeah, let's just match the volume so we can actually hear the difference. There we go. So obviously it's not going to be perfect, but when I clicked on the auto makeup gain just to test it out, that was way louder than the uncompressed sound. So if you could hear it, when I have the uncompressed one on, it just doesn't sound as clear as well. That compression's really bringing the elements that are too loud a bit down, which with the volume adjustment, because of the compressor, bringing everything else up, you can start to hear all of the elements a little bit clearer. I also think it makes the voice pop just a little bit more, which is quite nice. So let's just have a listen again and I'll show you what I mean. It's very subtle, but it definitely is just bringing everything together in a really pleasing way, just making the whole track sound a bit more full, a bit more polished, and just that further step to being ready to be released. Of course, you can do this with the stock plugin in Reaper perfectly fine, but if you did want a third-party recommendation for a compressor on your master, then I would definitely recommend the CLA2A by Waves. It's an emulation of a very famous compressor, the LA2A, and it just sounds amazing on masters. It's very simple. It's just got a gain knob and a peak reduction knob, and the gain is for after the compression, and the peak reduction is just how much gain reduction do you want. And you don't have to worry about attack, release, ratio. It's just a great sounding compressor. Sounds super natural, and I can't recommend that one enough. So the final and probably one of the most important steps of mastering is using limiters. Now, limiters will of course affect the tone of your sound a bit, but that's what the previous 4 steps were all about, was shaping the tone and making sure the song sounds right in general for this stage. And limiting is bringing that volume up to the right level. You want to bring it up to a volume which can compete with the other songs on the radio, on streaming services. And typically when you're mixing, I mean, look at the track here. Some very quiet bits in this, and you really want to just bring it up to the right level. That's all limiting is, and the way you do this in Reaper is using the master limiter plugin. So if we just type that in and double click that, there we go. And a limiter is essentially a very aggressive compressor, and by aggressive I mean the ratio is just crazy high. You're making sure that at a certain point no volume is going to get past that, and you have a few ways of adjusting it. So let's look at the important parts of the limiter. I'm not going to do all of them because typically you're not going to use all of them in a master situation. You may use the other ones in terms of using a limiter for specific elements, like I use limiters on bass quite a lot because it's just a great way to get a consistent low end in your mix. But yeah, so we have threshold here, which works the same as a compressor. At what point do you want the limiter to kick in? Attack, the same, and release is the same as well. This is just how quickly do you want it to kick in and how quickly do you want it to let go. Hold is how long do you want it to hold once it's been hit. So it's kind of like the bit before the release. So you have a release which is like how long do you want it to fade out for. If it's 1 millisecond, then it's going to be really quick. And if it's at a number like 1,000 at the top, then it's going to take that much longer just to smoothly let go of the limiting effect. Hold is how much do you want the limiter to be doing its full amount of work, full amount of gain reduction once it's kicked in, basically. So the limit, which is also called the ceiling, is the level of dB that the volume just cannot pass. Typically, you're going to go for -1 for this. It's hard to scroll it in, so I'm just going to type it in. But yeah, typically you want to go for -1 on this, as -1 dB is the sort of recommendation for streaming services, and let's be honest, most of us are going to be uploading to streaming services anyway. So let's adjust these parameters as I'm listening to the loudest part of the song and try and get the desired volume that I want without completely destroying the sound of the song. So if you're looking at the reduction part down here, which it's kind of hard not to when it's going crazy like that, I'm typically getting between -1 and -2 dB of gain reduction. It's something to keep your eye on, but I'm definitely more listening to make sure that my sound isn't distorting too much. And over here you can see that the level going in is -4.6, didn't mean to click that. And then the level coming out is -1.1, which is just below our limit. I'm happy with that. And the main thing I was doing was adjusting the threshold so it was at the right amount so I could get it all the way up there. And then all I'm doing with the attack, hold and release is just playing about with them until I get a natural sound. I found that having too high of a release just pushed it out of that area of distortion. It wasn't distorting, but I could just feel that it's possible that some distortion is going to come up at some point. It just felt like it was sort of on the edge of that, and the attack is doing the same thing, but the hold is more importantly just keeping everything a bit more even. All I'm trying to do is increase the volume without affecting the sound too much, or in a negative way, of course. But that is the main purpose of limiting, to bring that volume up to the correct level. Of course, things to look out for with the limiter is the distortion, first and foremost. Is it crunching your track? Is it making it sound different tonally? In my opinion, unless you're using a specific limiter for a specific character, it should be a rather transparent effect, meaning that it shouldn't color the tone at all of your track. It should just make it louder. That's the whole point of limiting. And the other thing to look out for is any unwanted ducking effects, like in the compression that we spoke about, whether it's ducking slowly or pumping really slowly, or if it's pumping really fast. It's all about finding that middle ground that makes the limiter sound as natural as possible. And of course, always double check the requirements that you're going to need for whatever service you're putting your music onto, whether it's a streaming service, whether you're going to use CDs or tape or vinyl, whatever it is. Just make sure that you have that in mind, because then your music will sound the best it can on the intended platform it's going to be made for. And finally, for our third-party recommendation of a limiter, I would highly recommend FabFilter L2. It's a very transparent limiter, and it's also just so intuitive with the layout. It's very simple, but it also has the options to go a bit more in depth with it, and it just does what a limiter is supposed to do, but really well. Now, the final step of mastering is to take a break and check it later on. Our ears can definitely get fatigued, especially listening to the same song over and over again, to the point where you're probably going to start making changes that don't need to be made to the track or even hurt the track. So it's best to take a break and then come back to it. At this point in the mastering process, you should be about 90% done. This is just the final step to make sure that you didn't miss anything with a fresh head and a fresh set of ears. Also, referencing other music is a great way to reference your master. Find a song that you know is well mastered, and find a song that you know is well mixed and well mastered in the same sort of genre as yours, so you can hear how each of the elements are being presented in the song. And referencing on other listening systems, not just your headphones and your studio monitors, but of course using Bluetooth speakers or your AirPods or any listening device that you have around. The more stuff you listen through, the better your master will be, because you'll be able to hear how each speaker system is affecting the sound of your master. And the goal of mixing and mastering should really be, how can I make my music sound the best in every possible situation? Of course, there's always going to be things that you wish you could do for specific systems, but in general, you just want your music to sound the best it possibly can on all systems with just that one track, rather than a huge amount of different masters for each playback system. But once you come back to it, unless you've completely messed up the mastering process in the first place, this is just some final tweaks to the effects you've already got on there. Don't go adding crazy amounts of plugins over the top of what you've done, because chances are that's not going to help. I would always suggest that if you feel like you need to add 10 different more plugins on top of what you've done for mastering, maybe go back to the start and question why the first 5 didn't do what you wanted it to do. So hopefully with all of these steps, you'll now feel a lot more comfortable mastering your own music before you release it. Just make sure to listen to the music and really pay attention to how each effect is altering the sound, and definitely master with your ears rather than your eyes. For more in-depth tutorials, tips and techniques, and much more, check out homemusicmaker.com, and also check out our forum at forum.homemusicmaker.com to speak with some like-minded people. Both of those links will be down in the description below, as well as the links to our social media. If you like this video, then please consider liking, subscribing, and hitting that notifications bell so that you never miss a video in the future. And feel free to leave any comments in the section below regarding your experience with mastering in Reaper, or any questions you might have so that we can reply and start a chat about this. Thanks once again for watching. We'll see you in the next video.